House Republicans have passed a bill banning transgender women and girls from school sports teams, expanding the debate around transgender athletics to a national scale.
The bill is titled the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act and was sponsored by Representative Greg Steube of Florida. It was passed in a party line 219 to 203 vote, and according to The Hill, it is the first, quote, standalone bill to restrict the rights of transgender people considered in the House. The legislation would amend Title IX to recognize sex as, quote, based solely on a person's reproductive biology and genetics at birth. I think it's probably no surprise, Jason, that I am in huge support of this bill. I played sports all throughout, my young life. I played club sports in college, and I actually played on teams that were mixed gender. So when I was at Georgetown, our club field hockey team was allowed to have men on it because it's not a very popular sport for men in the United States. And even then, we had rules that you could only have 2 men on the field at a time as a recognition that there's a basic unfairness because of the mismatch of biological advantages that exist between the sexes.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say that. I mean, I was looking at something by a guy named Dr. Eric Villain, and he is someone who advises the NCAA. And he's saying that a lot of these rules are not grounded in science. Now, I'll say this. When it comes to transgender young people, I'm much more concerned with other issues than sports. I'm concerned with things like suicide. I'm concerned with bullying. I'm concerned with homelessness. Those are the issues when it comes to transgender people that I'm much more concerned with than whether they play sports. And as a matter of fact, transgender people make up about 0.4% of the population. And of that 0.4%, there are estimates that about 1.8 of them 1.8 of school children now identify as trans. I think that's an overestimate.
Right.
But let me just say, the trans kids that play sports, that's 12%. Let's call it 1.5%. 12% of that 1.5% are trans athletes. So this is not some big sweeping issue where you're seeing it everywhere. And as a matter of fact, we can take a place like Utah. In the state of Utah, there are 4 transgender athletes out of 75,000 athletes at the K-12 level.
It may not be a big issue, but it's an issue that matters on the individual level. To those girls who are missing out on going to their state championship, who are not able to stand up on the podium because they were beat in the swimming pool by a man, that matters to them, right? And that's an issue of basic unfairness. And the other part of this that I think conservatives actually don't talk about enough is the safety aspect. And I mean that in two ways. One, safety on the field. If you're playing a team sport and you're up against someone who has this massive biological advantage of strength and speed, it is far more likely for a woman to get hurt in that situation. I've seen it firsthand on the field hockey field. These guys are running through women like it's nobody's business because the level of athleticism is just so different. And then there's the issue in the locker rooms, because you have women on track teams in the Northeast who are talking about how they're in the locker room with someone who is having an erection while they're changing, and the school tells them, actually, you're the problem and you need to pick a different locker room if you have a problem with it because this person says that they're a woman. I'm not okay with that.
Yeah, well, we're talking about girls, not women for the most part. We're talking about girls and boys, not women and men. But I'll say this. So there are a couple of things. Number one, going back to that doctor, Eric Villain, he talks about people talking about a biological advantage, and that depends on the sport. So, for example, men are generally and boys are generally taller, so that you might have an advantage in swimming. Of course, we had Leah Thomas. She's 6'5". She's got a 6'5" wingspan. She's going to have a little bit of advantage, even though she lost a lot of those races. She won a couple of them, but she lost many of them as well. But in a sport like gymnastics, it actually doesn't benefit you to be a man. So a lot of this depends upon the sport. The other thing that I'll say is a lot of people, this has gone both ways, because there was a trans male athlete, born female. Her name was his name was Mac Begg, and he was Yes, he was forced
Don't
to
switch yourself up there. I know it's confusing.
Yeah, no, it is. It is. I mean, we learn language a particular way. We learn our pronouns a particular way. But I'm not going to disrespect Mac. And Mac was forced to compete against the girls. Mac wanted to compete against boys in wrestling and ended up winning a state championship against girls because they wouldn't let him compete against boys. And people were upset either way. There was somebody who was upset that this person was able to compete against girls. So it's really, a lot of it sometimes comes down to winning. And when the AP reached out to state leaders in a lot of these places that have banned transgender athletes, they asked them, do you have any examples of any trans athletes in your state? So states like Tennessee, they asked Jim Justice in West Virginia. I interviewed Governor Kristi Noem in South Dakota. And what you found was none of them could cite any examples of trans athletes. They are just like talking about, well, it could happen one day. I mean, I suppose you could buy snow plows for Phoenix because it could snow one day, but this is not really an issue. It hasn't been an issue. And even in the states where they do have trans athletes, they're so rare. A lot of young trans people would rather do makeup tutorials, than actually play a sport. Again, Louisiana banned trans athletes. There are no known trans athletes in the state. So I think this is, when we're talking about trans issues on the left and the right, we should be concerned on the ones that are actually causing people harm, causing people to die. A lot of that comes down to, like I said, suicide. A lot of it comes down to homelessness. A lot of it comes down to bullying. Those are the issues that I'm most concerned with. But when we're talking about these sports issues, it's a very effective thing, as you and I discussed. It's very effective because it takes away this kind of feminist argument from the left and kind of puts it on the right, where they're saying they're protecting women and girls, and the left hasn't really come up with a response for it. But I kind of err on the side of, I guess the libertarian or classical liberal kind of response, where it's kind of like, all right, I'm not really offended by trans athletes playing sports. I think
to me,
much
as a woman
issues.
and as a former female athlete and as a young girl who was in those locker rooms, I just find it to be so obvious that on the issues of fairness and safety and respect for women's spaces, biological men shouldn't be in there. It's inappropriate. And this issue goes beyond sports, too. It's a question of, should biological men be housed in women's prisons? There have been cases where women...
That's a real issue. I think that...
Yeah, and then that's the same idea of having that ability to have privacy from members of the opposite sex. There's been cases where biological men have gone into saunas or gyms and been in the women's locker room, and consistently women are told that our instinct to feel unsafe in that situation is wrong. And there's a wonderful book called The Gift of Fear, and it talks about how we have these gut instincts and this ability to protect ourselves from potentially unsafe situations. And we are teaching young girls right now to ignore that gut instinct when a biological man comes into their private space. And that could have really dangerous effects for them later in life when they are refusing to listen to that thing in their head that's innate that says this is not right.
Yeah, I think, early in my teaching career, I used to talk to some of the football players, and they would be afraid of a gay athlete in their locker room. Now it's not even an issue. They don't even think about, that the fact that someone could be gay or someone could be sexually attracted to them. Now it's not an issue. And when we talk about people being afraid, when it comes to sexual assault, women get sexually assaulted by straight men in most cases. And girls get sexually assaulted by straight men in most cases. It's not trans people when it doesn't bear out.
Well, but a trans person could be straight.
But let's actually move on. This is a really good conversation, and it's one that we're not going to resolve today. But, we have to actually talk about what's going on next week on Rising. Robbie and Bree will be back with you to break down all of the Twitter drama that went down today. This was fun, Amber. I love these conversations. We're definitely going to have to do this together again. very soon. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed it. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. Thank you so much for tuning in to The Hills Rising, and we'll see you next time.